Welcome to an episode of Protocols, Payloads, and Pints. I'm Robert Rand.
And I'm Alex Zachman.
Excited to have you with us today. Alex, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about how we came up with this unique podcast talking about data and global trade and a little bit of the inspiration.
Yeah, I think some of it is that you're a good mensch, and we've always had great conversations together. And a good chunk of this kind of spawned off of both you and I being incredibly frustrated at all of the self-promoting on LinkedIn, all of the AI slop, people being overly polished and not actually honest about what's happening. And I think you and I have kind of been in the consulting and tech space long enough to know that people sling a lot of bullshit to sell product. And, at the end of the day, yeah, revenue numbers are important, but nobody's actually having real conversations slinging product. And I think, this conversation presents, between our Rolodexes, we can actually have an honest conversation with folks in government, with other ISVs, with retailers, wholesalers, manufacturers, and actually talk about, kind of the issues of the day and kind of the way that like the Guardian or the Atlantic or BBC has a conversation. There's not really anybody in the tech industry having an honest conversation about, what does the digital transformation today look like? Why is it that every AI adoption is failing and looking a clusterfuck? Why are people making comments about, hey, we're not going to lay off, and then we lay off, and then we go, oh, well, our productivity went way down, or hey, we have this rosy optimistic picture of what something's going to be, but it doesn't actually work.
And I think that's inherently a lot of the challenge, is that people think that they know what digital transformation looks like, but it's such an evolution right now. And there's so much pressure coming down through organizations to adopt AI, to cut staff, to do other things, and often carts before horses. Things are messy out there.
The reality is last year we had a conversation about digital transformation with a company that was still running an ERP running on COBOL. Like, it's not a realistic expectation to say that you're going to have all these agentic things and everybody's going to magically adopt technology like Zoomers when, boomers are still in the workforce. And, the reality is that you and I are elder millennials and, we still interact in a certain way. And I think people are more overly optimistic and rosy about what the technology is versus where it actually is. And then what does change management and like adoption look like? The reality is we're still on the early adoption curve of what AI looks like, right? Like right now, AI is a combination of machine learning, large language models, frontier models. But, it's like saying the Motorola brick phone or the car phone that sat under your seat with an antenna that popped out of the front fender was, what mobile phones are today. The reality, right, is this has more compute power than what put us on the moon 50 years ago. So if we think that we know what something looks like, reality is most businesses are still running technology that's 10, 20 years old. Are they going to adopt everything that a B2C market is going to adopt? No. So I think it's worthwhile to have an honest conversation where, yes, you and I would love business, but at the end of the day, like the vast majority of people are, trying to figure out what's actually going on and how do I meaningfully do this. And I think nobody's actually having the conversation without trying to hawk shit.
Right. And I think the other side of it is that the technology, they may still be on AS400, right? They may have an older tech stack. There may be challenges with adopting new technology, with integrating new technology across a business, et cetera. But the consumer, the client, the buyer, et cetera, that their expectations are shifting. And so especially, talk about us as elder millennials, but they're newer generations that don't want to call in a phone order or don't want to, do it the old fashioned way. And so for businesses that have been in manufacturing, distribution, et cetera, for many, many decades, sometimes significantly longer than that, they're being I don't know if forced is the right word, but they're certainly feeling the pain if they're not starting to adopt newer technologies and newer methods. And I learned years and years ago in my agency days, um, somebody that I look up to told me not to use myself as a barometer, because just because I wouldn't buy something from an ad on a certain social media platform, or just because I wouldn't, didn't mean that others weren't going to react differently, and that you have to think about different consumers, different markets, different habits, and so forth, and you need to be able to lean in if you want to be able to capitalize on those markets. And at the end of the day, I mean, that's what we're talking about. It's business. And so I think that that's what people are grappling with. It's yes, they can't turn everything upside down in a day, and just revolutionize everything. But what do they need? And in my history in the industry, I've always loved talking about table stakes, and what are today's table stakes and what will tomorrow's be, and trying to at least stay maybe not 10 steps ahead, but a couple of steps ahead has become the challenge. And I think where a lot of organizations are struggling right now is that they're dropping everything for different AI projects and other things that, to your point, are often a flop, or often costing them a lot more than they anticipated, or creating a lot more internal friction, or whatever the problems are. But they're still not necessarily meeting bare minimums in areas that they really need to be.
Yeah. So the funny thing, right? My head of product jokes that we always want to litmus test everything we're doing, so we're not getting high on our own supply. And I was. I have kind of a love-hate relationship with Microsoft, like most people, right? It works, but it's also become very bloated in some ways. But I was at a conference earlier this week, and somebody there had the comment that they were doing some agentic modeling on finance flows, and they were 100% accurate. And somebody came up to me afterwards and asked what my thoughts were. And I'm like, that's kind of bullshit, because I've been in systems integration long enough to know that you're never going to have 100% on anything and then throw in some agentic stuff. And, I think, again, it goes back to, can you have an honest conversation in an honest way where it's not overly corporate? I'm not beating a company drum. It's having an honest conversation. Yes, I'm purposely cursing in this. Yes, we're purposely bringing alcohol into this because, everything gets overly stuffy. But at the end of the day, I travel all around Europe and North America. And when you actually sit somebody down for cocktails or pints and have a conversation outside of a PowerPoint deck, it's a very different conversation. And I think it's important to kind of break it down. And, to use a saying from my time in the Army too, right? There is always a better village idiot. It is important to sit and figure out why things fail and have a conversation. Case studies are great to look at, but the reality is my company has serviced over 700 projects. I can make the data say whatever the fuck I want it to say. Company XYZ is not you. It's more important to say, okay, what's actually happening and how do we make it work for you? Or looking at something academically versus, okay, I need to sell more Salesforce. I need to sell more Dynamics. I need to sell more Sage. I need to sell more NetSuite. The reality is the industry is set up to sell product, not necessarily take care of the customer. And I think it's important for folks to, kind of understand what that dynamic looks like. And, I'm probably going to get some hate and shade for, kind of having a, honest conversation about how the tech industry works. But, we're kind of at, another industrial revolution. The way we're doing business is changing. You hear conversations about a bubble. I do think it's a bubble, but that doesn't mean that we're going to go back to what things were without machine learning and without large language models. We 100% will continue to use those.
Right. When but I do think dot-com bubble burst, it's not that we went back, the internet disappeared. It's just that there needed
we
to
don't
be
use Yahoo anymore.
Reset. Yeah, but even after the bubble burst, we still did for a while. It wasn't and instantaneous. But like every tech revolution, over time you get winners and losers. And so far in AI, it has been jumping all over the place with who the winner is in whatever sector on whatever day of the week. Obviously, we all have some favorites at the moment, but those will continue to evolve. And it's you mentioned sitting down after the project, and sometimes in tech we call those post-mortems. It's a bit morbid. I usually stick with something more like retrospective, but it's important. I mean, I've been on the road the last couple of weeks, and will be for the weeks ahead, meeting with companies like Shopify and BigCommerce and Shopware, and being at different events, and so on and so forth. And it's so interesting, and because technology, obviously, especially publicly traded companies, and those that there was the pandemic high of sales of certain tech, and there's the push to try to keep up with the same sales volume, which if you've already kind of grabbed a certain amount of market during a time period and accelerated, it's the way I talk about Netflix, that if everybody's got a Netflix account, you can go to the next country and the next country. And at some point, Netflix better hope that there are potential subscribers on Mars, because you run out of accessible market. But I look at it and I see companies that are then, really, really, fighting for sales. And to your point, not always, and not speaking of any one company in particular at the moment, but not as focused on customer success. About they're playing checkers instead of chess. That they're trying to fill today's funnel at the expense of the longevity of the long term. And so, like in partnerships, in my role, there are a lot of organizations that have really reduced their partner teams to just being focused on revenue generation and not long-term customer retention, which partnerships generally should be involved in, not marketing and go to market and brand awareness and such, which again, working with different organizations, whether it's services partners or other technology companies or such, plays such a huge role. And we find that a lot of our great partners, that they don't just look at the referrals from partners, they look at the sales that they're making that are partner influenced, that they were able to win business because they have a relationship across the aisle, and in many cases across land barriers and oceans as well. And so we find that becomes important, and kind of that vision of, are your partnerships just a facility of sales, or are they really something more, becomes this really interesting conversation about where are you really positioning yourselves short term and long term. And I think that that kind of funnels its way down into the user bases and into where you see these companies going.
I think, right, like BlackRock has kind of gotten the Western world to kind of view growth at all costs, and we're realizing now that given the turbulent last year, or few years going back to COVID, right? Like, it's okay to have some down quarters and realize that, like, you don't need leadership change, or like for us on the tech or consulting side, right? Like, what works now is not what worked 2 years ago. Like, people aren't doing CapEx, they're figuring out how to do OpEx. Everybody's scared about kind of what's happening. But I think because the industry is so driven by KPIs right now, it's lost its humanity. And I had a mentor once say, making money is kind of like losing weight. If you focus on losing weight, you're going to gain weight. And if you focus on making money, you're going to lose money. And at the end of the day, business is about taking care of people, solving a problem, providing an experience, providing a good. And if you take care of the people that are transacting with you, money is a byproduct of that. And I think we've kind of lost sight of that.
Right. When you try to run a business purely from a spreadsheet, look, you need to be able to, pay the bills, and obviously businesses are run to turn profits. But I was on a partner town hall recently with perhaps the largest e-commerce platform, at least in North America. And they were talking about, or apologizing for how slow they've been to be able to respond to any new apps anybody submitting to be listed. And again, their user bases are thriving on the ability to leverage apps and different technology from different providers, and so stifling that painful. But they had really cut back a lot of staff in that area, as I understand it. And then they were also apologizing that they keep making kind of breaking changes and not telling partners until afterward. And when you're a small startup and things happen, okay, maybe people, as they say, in a lot of areas of tech, move fast, break shit. You, we've all seen it. We've all experienced some of it in tech. But when you get to a certain size, it's harder. And I think often people forget that so many people are counting on these organizations for their bread and butter, and that you're talking about people's livelihoods. And so that this all kind of comes full circle, that really thinking about things in those terms of, well, maybe we should slow down a notch, that it really is important to have the documentation ready and have announcements ready of these things and so on and so forth, and give people a little bit of time to adjust before things kick in. There's so much of that out there. But I'm gonna shift topics for a second, Alex, because you mentioned alcohol and I saw you lift your glass, but and we put pints right in the name of the podcast. But we haven't talked anything about that. You want to touch on that for a moment?
Yeah, I think, like I said, right, like the idea of it being in the logo is we've lost the third space to have the conversation about what's happening. So currently I'm enjoying currently I am in Sligo, Ireland. It is in the west of Ireland, just above Connemara, just below Donegal. So I'm enjoying a lovely IPA called West Coast IPA from Lowgill Brewery here in Sligo.
All right. Well, I'm sitting at home this morning in the East Coast of the United States. I arrived back in Miami last night and got home closer to midnight from my last trade show. So I'm giving a shout out to one of my local breweries that I love, Funky Buddha. But I'm hydrating with good old H2O. And
I
so
thought you were
I
going to tell
figured
me
that
it
this
was
is episode.
THC.
No. But I figured this is episode 0, so we're gonna start there and let's see what we can work our way up to.
Fair enough. We are working on some fun distillery and brewer sponsors. So the goal will kind of be to have a rotating selection, and then we can play the game of where in the world is Robert and Alex.
That's a fun game to play a lot of the time. Well, and Alex, I know that in your business dealings of late, you've been dealing with a lot of international trade and government NGOs and other sorts of situations where, especially in the age of, of maybe the resurgence of tariffs and different shifting global sentiments and certainly
Lions,
shifting
Tigers,
resources and
Trump,
such.
Carney, oh my.
Yeah, there you go.
Mm.
If you were to think about maybe some of the types of guests that we're anticipating in this first season, and some of the types of topics that you're hoping to make sure that we bring into it, and that way maybe the audience can hear our expertise in the questions more, but we'll be bringing in some heavy hitters in, I don't know if we'd call it the hot seat. We're a pretty friendly bunch, but what's your vision?
I mean, we the goal, right, is to have crack, but we're still going to slag the heck out of folks. No, I think, again, there isn't a third space to actually have the conversation. Most businesses aren't like you and I that go to a lot of conferences and regularly have kind of the pulse on this. But the idea, right, is that we're going to have a combination of merchants, manufacturers, wholesalers, retailers. We're going to have some other ISVs, some other software partners. And then the goal is to also have folks from various governments from the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, Ireland, eventually more of other parts of Europe and things like that. But as the trade landscape changes, as the needs for data change, as we look at things, nothing's really happening in a vacuum, right? Like we're kind of living at the there's a new 100-year or once in a lifetime event every other month at this point. The reality is there are several conflicts going on across the world. Tariffs have come back. You're starting to see trade agreements with new parts of the world. At the end of the day, how does a small business or small enterprise actually kind of navigate what that means? How does a multinational navigate what that means? I heard it kind of the other day. A gentleman from the Financial Times joked that there's basically Donald Trump, there's China, and then there's the friends of Mark Carney. So at the end of the day, what does it mean to have new trade relationships between the United States and the rest of the world? As trade relationships change with China, what does that mean? How do we move goods? How do we move data? What you know new platform, or how do we better translate and connect with people? Great, Canada wants to trade with Europe more, or China, or New Zealand, Australia. What does that actually mean? How do businesses go do that? We're starting to see the emergence of recession. How do businesses get supports? In Canada, there's Shred. There's grants available for businesses to be able to do things. In Ireland, there's the combination of the IDA, Enterprise Ireland. In Northern Ireland, there's Invest Northern Ireland. There's Innovate UK in Great Britain. So there's a lot of things that I think businesses don't really know how to kind of navigate from both, moving goods, what's the government seeing, what supports might be available. I think it's kind of, all up in conversation this season.
You've mentioned a few tidbits from your background. Maybe there's a good time for us to just tell the audience a little bit about us. Chances are we won't do too much of that across the future episodes. But Alex, you mentioned your background starting with maybe with the Army, but if you wouldn't mind explaining a little bit about what makes you an expert in technology and data and these different areas that we've been talking about.
Yeah. For me, most fun I ever want to have once, right? The joke is, I think the best thing that came out of it is that I now know how to bitch and complain and still work while I'm bitching and complaining. So I thoroughly appreciate former commanders and senior NCOs for teaching me that life skill. But you know kind of a bit of a heterogeneous background. I ended up going to school for biology and chemistry. I had fellowships with NASA, NOAA, and NSF. Did a fair bit of work around machine learning back in the day. I, have run an agency slash consultancy for the last decade. We recently acquired a new agency consultancy, and we're in the process of spinning up a reg tech platform to help with compliance. We have a footprint across multiple jurisdictions. So, we've engaged in Central Europe. Obviously, I'm sitting here in Ireland. We have a good footprint in Ireland and the UK. Our, operational headquarters are now in Toronto. And then we have kind of a distributed workforce in the US with kind of a gravitational pull to the East Coast. Historically, we've helped mid-market to enterprise organizations, or for our European friends, we've helped kind of mid-sized SMEs to larger multinationals. And I think, the goal of this is how can we make data integrations and kind of navigating the current turbulence. How can we give you, some knowledge to kind of go tackle that? Um, yeah.
Well, and on my side, uh, I'm really just here to be a good nerd, right? I mean, that's I'm here to geek out, but that's what I've been
Well, we
doing
did
my whole
cover that you're a
life.
mensch.
Well, I appreciate that. What takes one to know one. No, my story goes that by the third grade, they were pulling me out of class for an hour a day to help the computer teacher, and nothing's really changed since. I had a little bit of a mechanical engineering background. And in college, as I was studying, kind of decided to broaden my horizons from there, and learned that I liked, some of the business side and other side, and kind of wound up going in a bit of a different direction from the original robotics and Westinghouse science projects and things like that I'd been doing from high school forward. um, and wound up in the digital agency space myself for a decade. My brother was the CEO, my sister-in-law was the CFO, and I was the CTO of an agency that brought brands like Swiss Gear and Invicta watches into e-commerce. We were the digital agency doing the digital marketing for organizations like the Florida Panthers, Inc. 5000 company, Google Premier Partner. We were acquired in 2017 and exited. And, so that was a wild ride, and have stayed in technology since, working with organizations in areas like web hosting in the cloud, and, had a great run with JetRails, where I hosted the JetRails podcast. That was the last podcast I hosted, and 100 episodes of that left me wanting to figure out the next thing. And Alex, very glad we're doing this. But have otherwise been working in the integration space in the last 3 years, heading up partnerships, a chief partnership officer at iPass.com, integration platform as a service. And really, for me, what's interesting about that is that we get to work with so many great services partners, the agencies, the SIs, the VARs, the MSPs, the consultancies. And so seeing what they're dealing with, and all the great technology companies, the ERPs, point of sales, CRMs, PIMs, warehouse management, order management, sales tax exemption certificate management, accounts receivable. I mean, the list goes on and on. I mean, we've been, having some great expansion with the nonprofit space, and dealing with, nonprofit CRMs and fundraising and donor management platforms. And, you just start to really see, as we deal with data with HR systems, and it's such a unique vantage point. And back to the protocols, and thinking about the internationalization of data, right? That, data security, data governance, data regulation, and how these things come together. There's so many interwoven topics that we've already touched on in this episode 0, that I'm really looking forward to getting deeper into. But I think that it gives us such a unique opportunity together, given that we've seen not only so many successes, but realistically, so many failures, right? I mean, how many projects have you seen through the years that did not launch successfully on their first attempt?
Well,
How many
I
tech companies have you seen rise and fall
well, I think
alongside you?
this is what I'm also going to call out, right? Like we're batting a 92% success rate on go live. We're 80% on time, 72% on budget. But across just shy of 1,000 total projects. But people telling you everything's going to be peachy keen and all of that fun stuff, right? Like the reality is every project gets fucked, every project goes sideways. There's always going to be friction and frustration. And again, I think it's important to like have the honest conversation about that, right? Like it's not a bad thing that a project goes sideways. It's kind of inevitable. It becomes more like, how do you provide the tools to get it back on track and get it across the line, versus going, oh, woe is me, this thing, got fucked.
I mean, I haven't been in the agency space since 2017, but one of my favorite things that I learned on the job was the risk analysis, and going through with the client the risk of what would delay the project or what would increase the price on the project, scope changes, things like that. and where we typically run into them, what the most common issues are in the types of projects that we were dealing with. And for me, that was getting into those conversations, staying ahead of them was transformative. I find that today, we see a lot of projects, um, that go off the rails in different sectors. People coming to us, kind of after the fact, that sort of thing. When if they had a good project plan from the beginning that had dependencies, where they knew who needed to be doing what and when, and how that was going to impact the next stage and the next stage, that they probably would have been okay, right? But there's also just that reactive way of looking at a tech stack, right? Of, okay, we need to solve this one problem today, as opposed to taking a little bit more time and planning out where do we want to be with this tech stack in 3 years or 5 years. For the team that I'm a part of, where we act as a data hub and not just, a connector from A to B, but really, the hub where every integration is standardized. We see organizations that have just wound up with all of these point-to-point connectors that they can't manage and maintain reasonably, that are just this huge thorn in their side of things breaking, and different teams involved in each one, and trying to think more proactively about, sometimes you just need to turn on another spoke and you need to get data flowing with one more system, and you don't want to go back to the drawing board, or you need to upgrade or replace a spoke, right? It is time to get off of AS400 or that COBOL system or whatever it may be. And, so just thinking about that evolution, it's as much as everybody's focused on what is next in their tech stack in terms of AI is all about data. Trash in, trash out, right? And so thinking about the data governance, the data hygiene becomes more important than ever in breaking down the data silos. And so, they're the things that consume me day in and day out, of how do organizations set themselves up, not just to get through a short-term project successfully, but, even if that project, I think what you and I do all day, every day, is trying to simplify the complex, but it's really it is complex under the hood, and thinking about that long-term setup. And, AI, as much as we're all using it heavily and love it, it's also right now a recipe to disaster, in terms of, a lot of cases you're writing something, is the code that when we're talking code, is the code that you're writing scalable? Is it secure? Is it maintainable? Is it just a bunch of random spaghetti code, as we say? And so it's almost like, did you, back in the day, where you would have quality control with an agency, with a dev team that was experienced and had processes in place? Or is it more like you hired somebody on Fiverr, and there's great people for hire as freelancers, but is it more like you hired someone and this is this one-off piece of technical debt that you're now going to be stuck with? And so just looking at a lot of those realities through the lens of our experience in the industry, of, what is it that you're really getting? And is getting the fastest possible thing always the best long-term outcome in terms of the business success, continuity, safety, etc.? Just thinking a few steps ahead is, I think, the biggest challenge that everyone is facing right now, and in the breakneck pace that everyone's trying to move. Alex, we've lost your audio. Still not getting it.
Did that fix it?
That did.
Okay.
All
so,
right.
the reality, right, is like AI is the shiny object syndrome. If you are still on Microsoft Dynamics Great Plains, we might need to get you to upgrade to a more modern ERP before we have a very flashy agentic or LLM strategy for the organization. And I think, the challenge, right, is with an economic slowdown and everybody trying to figure out how to move forward sales, you have an economic driver to talk about the single point. And I think, given kind of where you and I sit, we're kind of looking, going, hey, we want businesses and enterprises to be successful, then it doesn't really so much matter like, hey, are we re-implementing Sin 7? Are we re-implementing NetSuite? Or does it need to be a migration? Do we, really need to go from Magento to Shopify? Or can we just fix the current Magento instance and, figure out how to make that move forward?
There's going to be
Or
some
hey,
really strong opinions out there on those topics. I'll
oh,
tell you that. Yeah,
for
but
sure, right? Or, like OpenAI versus Anthropic. Like you and
right.
I might be sitting on the same side of the coin on that one. But at the end of the day, if you're rolling out agentic for kind of the first time, or you're leveraging a frontier model for the first time, half the battle is just moving forward. Like you don't necessarily need to leverage one or the other if you don't have a strong use case for one over the other. It's just figuring out how do you put a foot forward, and you might readjust the strategy in 2 or 3 years, and that's totally fine.
Right.
And the reality is things are moving fast enough that that's probably the case.
Yeah. And look, I mean, you mentioned legacy ERPs and AI. I mean, I was talking to a VAR from one ERP recently, where you mentioned, oh, that the platform that they specialize in recently got some AI added in, and I'm sitting on the seat of my chair because we have integrations to systems like OpenAI, and we can get the data from these legacy siloed systems to OpenAI with prompts and enhance the data and automatically have it flow wherever you need. And, there's things that we could do. So, all right, what have they added? And, are we still applicable there for that, for some of these use cases? And they described it as the old F1 button, that it would give you some idea of what you were looking at on the screen. And that was it. That's all you got it. And all that I could think of was like Clippy back in Microsoft Word way back when. It was like, yes, they've added something. Is it really what everybody needs, wants? Is it going to check the box of improving your productivity the way that you're looking? Not yet, no. And there's just so much of that out there where, for me, it's all about picking finite, specific projects, outcomes that you want to drive, and being able to measure against those, getting away from the behemoth of we need everything and thinking about what would be the most impactful. What's that painful process that the team is killing a lot of time on? Is it enhancing product descriptions? Is it categorizing the products? Is it, organizing the customers into segments based on certain data? What is it? And let's see if we can throw the AI at it. If we can do that and, get those limited wins and keep going from there, and
Oh yeah,
return on the investment.
having the executive alignment between C-suite and the technical folks. And
Well,
I
now
think
you're asking way too much. I'm not even.
but I would say, right, like joking aside, like one of my goals of this podcast, right, is that we create something that we're talking to both, and we're allowing and facilitating conversation between business leaders and technical teams, right? Like the reality is that, between the pair of us, we probably know 12 different programming languages, and we probably speak like 6 actual languages. You know, I think how to, creating a space to allow for those conversations to happen, to where management listens to this and goes, yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking. And tech is able to say, that's exactly what I'm thinking, in effect, right? Like if we're able to be the Tower of Babel to say, you know, here's an actual, like, honest to goodness, good conversation and good kind of roundtable discussion that isn't hawking stuff that, we have the conversation once a month, and then 2 weeks after the fact, we end up having an office hours where, we're able to dive in and kind of tackle conversations. Like, I think that's entertaining, but it's also meaningful for folks.
I would agree. And, before we wrap for today, I know that you've got some office hours that you've been setting up, and maybe we share that with the audience as a way to go from listening to us to maybe, getting a little bit more involved and being able to interact more directly. Um, what do you think about how the the listeners and viewers can can get a little bit of value out of that.
Yeah, I think, candidly, we still have to flesh out some of those details. But, idea right is we end up having it be incredibly fluid and dynamic. If there's the desire, we could potentially get a WhatsApp group kind of set up to allow for conversations and things to happen, with the idea that if we do set up a group like that, it is a very hard, hey, you're not selling to each other. It's more, uh, gentlewoman and gentleman kind of engagement of how do we actually solve problems and, not bang our own drum. But yeah, I think idea right is this gets launched 2 weeks after the fact. We end up having, an office hours posted. And we kind of, move that forward. It will probably be an evolving thing. As Robert kind of said, he hasn't done a podcast in a hot minute, and I haven't done, a podcast or webinar series, consistently since COVID. So, this is where I would ask for, a little bit of grace of, we are going to fall on our face and, politely knife hand us and tell us we're jacked up. Don't, just tell us we're fucking up. We're
Alex,
happy to adjust fire.
Yeah, no, just
yeah, it's all my fault. That's fine.
Yeah,
it's all my fault.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. Like the joke, right, is that I can be Canadian, I can be American, I can be Irish, I can be Northern Irish, I can be British. With all of those hats, right? I'm wrong somewhere in one of those hats.
Well, I'll stick to my headset as opposed to changing to too many hats, although I look good in a hat. Actually, I was hearing about a conference that I'm hoping to be at later this year where they're going to give me a hat. That, I thought that would be,
we just have to get you over to Ireland or Great Britain, and we'll get you like a proper hat, not just a baseball hat.
Well, we could certainly work on that. It's been a while since I made it across the pond. I'm due. Well, on that note, we really appreciate everybody tuning in, and a lot of great content and really great guests coming. So you'll be hearing from some really unique voices, and we'll be keeping them honest and keeping the content thoughtful and valuable. Looking forward to it. Alex,
yep,
thanks
100%.
for making a first great episode.